In the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union sent hundreds of thousands of troops into Finland expecting a rapid victory. What it encountered instead was silence, frozen forests, and a resistance that refused to break. The Red Army entered the Winter War with overwhelming numerical superiority. Tanks, artillery, and massed infantry columns pushed toward Finnish territory under the assumption that sheer force would crush opposition within weeks. Finland, by contrast, was outnumbered, under-equipped, and fighting in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Daylight was limited. Roads were scarce. The landscape favored defenders who understood it. Finnish units avoided direct confrontation, relying instead on mobility, camouflage, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Among them was a quiet farmer from Karelia, whose role would soon grow far beyond that of an ordinary infantryman. His name was Simo Häyhä. Hayha did not arrive as part of an elite unit or special program. He was a reservist, armed with a rifle, assigned to defend familiar ground. He wore white camouflage to blend into the snow and positioned himself in places where movement was nearly invisible. He avoided scopes that could reflect light, relying instead on iron sights to remain undetected. These choices were practical, not symbolic. They reflected an understanding of how easily a single mistake could mean death. Operating alone or in small groups, Hayha began targeting Soviet soldiers advancing through forest corridors and frozen clearings. Each engagement was brief. Each shot was deliberate. Then silence returned. What transformed Hayha from a skilled soldier into a problem for the Soviet army was not the number of men he killed in isolation, but the cumulative effect of his presence. Soviet units began to slow their advance in areas where he was believed to be operating. Patrols hesitated. Officers altered routes. Entire formations moved more cautiously through terrain that already limited speed. The forest became a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. Soldiers knew they were being watched, but not from where. This uncertainty eroded confidence and disrupted momentum at a time when speed was essential to Soviet plans. Attempts to neutralize the threat failed repeatedly. Counter-snipers were deployed. Artillery barrages were ordered into forested areas suspected of hiding Finnish marksmen. Patrols swept through snow-covered ground where footprints vanished quickly and sound carried unpredictably. None of it produced results. Hayha's discipline and patience allowed him to survive in conditions that punished even minor errors. He understood when not to fire, when to wait, and when to disappear. This restraint made him harder to find than a more aggressive fighter would have been. As reports filtered upward, Soviet commanders began to recognize that something was wrong. Units were encountering resistance disproportionate to the size of Finnish forces in the area. Casualties mounted in places where no major engagement was underway. The absence of visible enemy movement created anxiety. Soldiers feared exposure even while standing still. The front line did not collapse, but it stalled. Time was lost. Resources were diverted. Effort that should have been driving the offensive forward was instead consumed by the hunt for a single man. This disruption mattered because the Winter War was not supposed to be slow. Soviet strategy depended on rapid advances to overwhelm Finnish defenses before international pressure or prolonged resistance could complicate the campaign. Every delay increased political risk and exposed weaknesses in training, leadership, and morale. Hayha did not stop the Soviet army by himself in a literal sense. He did something more dangerous. He embodied the kind of resistance that could not be solved with numbers alone. By early 1940, the Soviet advance continued, but it carried a cost far higher than expected. The terrain, the climate, and the tactics of Finnish defenders combined to produce a grinding campaign instead of a decisive one. Within that environment, Hayha became a symbol of something the Red Army struggled to confront. Not heroism, but persistence. Not spectacle, but pressure. The war was still unfolding, but already it was clear that one sniper had forced a much larger force to hesitate, adapt, and bleed time it could not easily afford. This was the beginning of a problem the Soviet army never fully solved. As the Winter War dragged on, the Red Army's response to the threat posed by Finnish snipers grew increasingly desperate. Soviet commanders began allocating disproportionate resources to counter a danger that refused to present itself clearly. Specialized counter-sniper teams were deployed with explicit orders to hunt Hayha and others like him. Artillery units were instructed to saturate forest sections where gunfire had been reported, regardless of confirmation. Mortars churned up snow and trees, leaving scars across terrain that revealed nothing. These measures consumed time and ammunition while producing little effect. The forest absorbed violence without yielding targets. For Soviet soldiers advancing on foot, this imbalance became demoralizing. They were ordered forward into terrain where visibility was limited, sound was deceptive, and death could arrive without warning. The psychological impact was severe. Soldiers began to fear stopping, but also feared moving. Every tree line suggested danger. Every stretch of open snow felt exposed. Discipline weakened under constant tension. Patrols hesitated. Columns slowed. Officers struggled to maintain momentum while casualties accumulated without a visible enemy. Hayha's presence magnified these effects. Whether he was physically nearby mattered less than whether soldiers believed he might be. Rumors spread faster than orders. Stories of invisible shooters circulated through units, reinforcing the sense that the forest itself was hostile. This erosion of confidence mattered more than any single casualty count. Modern armies depend on cohesion and trust in command. The Winter War environment undermined both. Hayha continued to operate with extreme restraint. He did not seek confrontation. He did not reposition unnecessarily. He endured cold that caused frostbite and exhaustion, remaining motionless for hours to avoid detection. He packed snow into his mouth to prevent breath vapor from revealing his position. He avoided firing when the risk outweighed the benefit. These details, often reduced to legend later, were rooted in discipline rather than bravado. His goal was survival first, disruption second. Each day he remained active forced the Soviet army to adapt further, diverting attention from the broader offensive. The imbalance between Soviet expectations and reality became increasingly apparent. Commanders had anticipated rapid breakthroughs supported by massed firepower. Instead, they encountered resistance that exploited terrain and psychology rather than strength. The inability to neutralize individual threats highlighted gaps in Soviet training and flexibility. Countermeasures that worked in open terrain failed in forests. Numerical superiority offered limited advantage where lines of sight were measured in meters rather than kilometers. Hayha's effectiveness exposed these weaknesses repeatedly. As casualties mounted, pressure from Moscow intensified. The Winter War was becoming politically costly. International opinion shifted. The longer the conflict lasted, the more it undermined Soviet prestige. Every stalled advance contradicted the narrative of inevitable victory. Hayha did not influence diplomacy directly, but his contribution to delay amplified strategic consequences far beyond his position. Time became Finland's ally. Each day of resistance increased scrutiny and complicated Soviet objectives. The effort to eliminate Hayha culminated in focused attempts to draw him out. Soviet units used decoys, false movements, and heavy bombardment in suspected areas. These efforts demonstrated how seriously the threat was taken. An entire army adjusted behavior because of one soldier. That adjustment alone represented success. It meant the offensive was no longer operating at optimal speed or confidence. Even when Hayha was not present, his absence could not be confirmed. The uncertainty lingered. Eventually, the inevitable occurred. Hayha was severely wounded by an explosive bullet that shattered his jaw, removing him from the battlefield. His removal did not instantly restore Soviet momentum. The habits formed under pressure remained. Caution persisted. The forest did not become safe again overnight. The Red Army continued its advance, but it did so more slowly and at greater cost than planned. By the time the Winter War concluded, Finland had conceded territory but preserved its independence. the Soviet Union achieved its objectives only after suffering losses that shocked its leadership. Hayha survived, disfigured but alive, having spent the remainder of the war recovering. His role did not decide the outcome alone, but it demonstrated how a single disciplined soldier could impose costs on an army built around speed, scale, and intimidation. The Soviet army had learned a lesson it would not forget. In certain environments, control could be disrupted not by overwhelming force, but by patience, precision, and the refusal to be seen. The true significance of Simo Häyhä's impact became clear only after the fighting ended. When the Winter War concluded in March 1940, the Soviet Union had secured territorial concessions, but at a cost far higher than anticipated. Casualty figures stunned observers. The Red Army had expected a short campaign that would demonstrate strength and efficiency. Instead, it exposed weaknesses in leadership, training, and adaptability. The experience forced Soviet planners to confront uncomfortable truths about modern warfare in difficult terrain. Finland had not been defeated quickly, and the delay carried consequences far beyond the immediate conflict. International perception shifted. Military assumptions were questioned. The idea that numerical superiority alone guaranteed victory no longer held. Hayha's role fit squarely within this broader lesson. He did not act as a lone hero operating outside structure. He represented a disciplined approach that maximized environment, patience, and restraint. The Soviet army had been forced to respond to individuals rather than formations, to threats it could sense but not easily locate. This inversion of scale disrupted doctrine built around mass and momentum. The Forest War demanded adaptation that the Red Army had not yet mastered. Hayha's effectiveness illustrated how rigid systems struggled when confronted with decentralized resistance. In the years that followed, the Soviet military absorbed the lessons of the Winter War with urgency. Training programs were revised, winter warfare doctrine expanded, equipment and camouflage improved. Commanders paid closer attention to terrain and logistics. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, many of these changes were still incomplete, but the experience in Finland had already altered expectations. The Red Army no longer assumed that smaller forces could be brushed aside without cost. Hayha's war had contributed to that shift. For Hayha himself, the war ended quietly. He returned to civilian life after recovery, avoiding public attention and rejecting the mythology that grew around his name. His service was acknowledged, but he did not seek recognition. This silence reinforced the nature of his contribution. He had not fought for fame or symbolism. He had fought to slow and advance, impose cost, and survive. The legend that followed was created by others, shaped by numbers and stories that simplified a far more complex reality. The idea that Hayha stopped the Soviet army is not literal, but it captures something essential. He forced hesitation where speed had been assumed. He created doubt where confidence had existed. He compelled an army designed for overwhelming force to adapt to a threat it could not easily overpower. In warfare, those effects matter. Momentum is fragile. Plans depend on timing. When timing slips, consequences multiply. The Winter War remains a reminder that modern armies do not fail only through defeat in battle. They fail when systems encounter environments they are unprepared to manage. Hayha's impact was magnified because it occurred at exactly such a point of vulnerability. The Red Army entered Finland expecting compliance and found resistance shaped by terrain, discipline, and patience. Hayha did not act alone in this resistance, but his presence became a focal point around which fear and caution accumulated. This is why his story endures, not because it represents superhuman ability, but because it reveals a structural truth. Large systems can be disrupted by small, well-placed pressures. Control can erode without collapse. Victory can be delayed without being denied. In the Winter War, the Soviet army eventually advanced, but it did so under conditions it had not planned for and at a cost it had not accepted. The sniper did not win the war, but he ensured it would not be easy.